Hello, my name is Gail Keys, and I'm with 40 Music Productions. Today we want to welcome you to Hidden Gems History Talks, where we uncover the forgotten stories behind people who helped shape our world. In each episode, we meet guests who have rare insights or remarkable connections to history. And today is no different. We'd like to introduce you to Mrs. Lynne M. Jackson, the great-great-granddaughter of Dred and Harriet Scott of the 1857 Supreme Court decision. Mrs. Jackson is the president and founder of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation. Her employment highlights include Byron Cave Lighton, Paisner Law Firm, Ford Motor Company, Cast Logistics, Girl Scout Council of Greater St. Louis. She is the co-founder of the Prophecy and Apologetics Research and Resource Center, teaching biblical apologetics via the scriptures and science. She has served in many volunteer capacities that include being the vice president of Community Women Against Hardship, the president of Black Women's Entrepreneurial Network. She was the board director of the St. Louis Artists Guild, and the list goes on. Currently, she serves as the president and executive director of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation, a director on the boards of the Freedom Suits Memorial Foundation and the Jefferson National Parks Association. She has been instrumental in getting Dred Scott installed into the Hall of Famous Missourians at the state capitol in Jefferson City. She commissioned and raised funds for the first and only statue of Dred and Harriet Scott, installed at the Old Courthouse here in St. Louis. She designed and raised funds for the new memorial monument for Dred Scott at Calvary Cemetery, also here in St. Louis. She launched a Dred Scott stamp campaign, which is ongoing. With Greenwood Cemetery, she helped spearhead the first headstone for Harriet Scott in 2008. She consulted with the National Park Service on the new Dred and Harriet Scott Gallery for the reopening of the Old Courthouse in St. Louis this year, and she was honored to cut the ribbon at that opening. She has received many awards, including the recent Spirit of Justice Award from the St. Louis Bar Foundation in 2024. The National Medal of Honor from Daughters of the American Revolution was another prominent award she received. She has spoken as a keynote speaker for Roots Tech in 2024, a global genealogy conference with a global audience of over 1.6 million people. She has spoken twice at the National Association of Attorneys General. She has appeared in numerous documentaries and media productions, including Amend on Netflix, A More or Less Perfect Union on PBS, and she speaks around the country on her famous ancestors. The foundation will celebrate 20 years in existence in 2026. She is a graduate of the Alida Ward Wells Classical Piano Studio and creates workshops for biblical apologetics. She teaches Old and New Testament. She has produced her own cable TV program, co-hosted a radio program at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, and she enjoys sketching, woodwork, and puzzles. And we are honored to have her here with us today on Hidden Gems. So we're so honored and happy to have you today, Mrs. Jackson. Thank you for coming. And can you begin by just telling us about Dred and Harriet Scott.
Well, Dred and Harriet Scott are two formerly enslaved people who have an incredible story of helping our nation end slavery by first trying to get their own family free. Their story starts in 1799 approximately, when we believe Dred Scott was born. He was born in Southampton, Virginia, into the Peter Blow family. Peter Blow married Elizabeth Taylor, and it looks through the records that Dred Scott came through her family. And his name ultimately was changed. Originally, he was named Sam Blow, but he did change his name to Dred Scott. And the Dred sometimes appears as Ethelred, which looks like Etheldred. I don't like that. But that name is also in the Elizabeth Taylor family. So that's why we believe that his parents and he ultimately come from the wife of the Peter Blow family. At any rate, Peter and Elizabeth had 11 children, and their family plays a huge role in the Dred Scott story. It's not your typical story of slaves being beaten and hated and killed and so poorly treated, but in this situation, the Blow family really supported Dred Scott and his family for freedom, and that is a unique thing.
Yes, it is very unique.
Mm-hmm.
And what made them different from the average slaves?
Well, Dred and Harriet, once they were a family, made a decision to sue their owner, which at this time now was someone other than the Blow family, was Mrs. Irene Emerson. And they made that decision because they felt that they had already attained their freedom. And so, to just go back and recap a little bit, the Blow family that owned Dred eventually sold him after they moved from Virginia to Alabama to St. Louis. And the mother died in 1830. The father was ill. Ultimately, he died in 1831, but he sold some things to cure debts from his life and work and trying to have businesses along the way. And one of those items was what was considered property at that time, slaves. So he sold Dred Scott to Dr. John Emerson, and Dr. John Emerson was an Army surgeon. This Army surgeon was posted at Fort Armstrong in Illinois, which was a free state, and also at Fort Snelling, which is now Minneapolis, Minnesota area. Fort Snelling also in free territory.
So they had their freedom, or he had his freedom, and then what happened to it?
Well, let's talk about that. They got their freedom by virtue of a law that said if you go as an enslaved person, if you go to free territory and have residence there for some time, not even a very long time, then you are free because you lived in free territory. And the law is called once free, always free. Dred lived in Illinois, he lived in Fort Snelling, but also that's where he met Harriet Robinson. And Harriet Robinson became Mrs. Dred Scott. She also lived in free territory. So as a family, when they were brought to St. Louis by the widow of Dr. Emerson, then they realized for sure that they had their freedom, but now they were back in Missouri. Missouri is a slave state, and they were not allowed to have their freedom at that time.
Oh boy. So tell me more.
Well, at the time that they decided that they had freedom, Mrs. Emerson, now a widow because Dr. Emerson died shortly after they all came back to St. Louis. He died in 1843. They decided that Mrs. Emerson's not really one of our big fans, so maybe we need to look at this freedom in a more serious way. Now, they had been in free territory for several years, but in St. Louis, they also went to a church locally here, which is now called Central Baptist. At the time, it was called Second African Christian Church, and they were under the tutelage of a Reverend John Anderson. Reverend Anderson was a black free man and an abolitionist who we believe clearly shared with them their right to freedom by virtue of the fact that he had worked with Another notable person of the past, Elijah P. Lovejoy. And Mr. Lovejoy was also an abolitionist white person who wrote extensively through his printing press and his newspaper against slavery. In fact, so much so that he was murdered for it. Reverend Anderson, we believe, witnessed that murder and came back from Alton to St. Louis. And as their pastor, he knew what the ins and outs were for slavery and freedom and shared with them that the law was on their side. So in 1846, on April the 6th, Dred and Harriet Scott both came to this courthouse. And it was a most amazing day, I'm sure, for them because there had been precedents for people doing this, even people who had lived at Fort Snelling. And so it was clear that if they filed for their freedom, that they should get their freedom. 1846, they came here. Dred filed papers. Harriet filed papers. They both had their own cases filed separately for freedom. I always look at that as a really important step because Harriet being the mother, if she won her case, their two daughters, which they now had, would be free. And if anything had happened to Dred, then Harriet still had a case in the courts. So it was like, let's give ourselves two chances at this and let's see what happens. So
That was remarkable. What happened with their petition? Was it granted?
yes, it was. And it was granted because they had every reason in the book to come to court and sue for the freedom that they believed they already had. A clarification on that point is a lot of people think that they went to sue to get their freedom to become free, but because of the law I mentioned, once free, always free, they believed that they had their freedom. And when Dr. Emerson died, they asked the widow, well, can we just have our freedom? We'll just leave. She said no, and they offered money to buy their freedom from her, which they had saved and scrimped and saved, and they had supporters behind them, the Blow family children. But she said no again, and that left them no recourse. So when they went to court, you have to have certain conditions, certain requirements, prerequisites, experiences, and they had all of them. So when their petition was granted, they were given a court date. But that was in 1846. The first court appearance was not until 1847.
And that must have been so hard and traumatic to be free and then to have your freedom taken away.
It is in the sense that being at Fort Snelling, they were, they were in a fort, and it was different than being in a city or on a plantation. They were workers, they were staff, but yet coming back to the city and coming back to Missouri, which was a slave state, even though the law, once free, always free, and this is very important, it said that even if you go back to a slave state or a slave area, you will still be free. That's what the law said, and yet they were being denied that freedom. So that's where their case was solid for them, and others had won this case, cases like this many times. This was something that the Missouri Supreme Court had to deal with, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Yeah, I just can't imagine that they could police the people who were free but living in a slave state. So I can see how that happened.
Well, once they got their case to come to court, they were here at the St. Louis Old Courthouse. And on that particular day, I'm pretty sure they came in thinking they were going to walk out with their freedom, but it just did not happen. It didn't happen because one of the individuals who was called to testify was supposed to clarify the fact that Mrs. Emerson, the widow Emerson, now was the true owner of the Scott family. And yet he said that his wife said that she was. And for those of you who have legal ears, you will recognize that that was hearsay.
Hearsay.
Exactly. And so that pretty much had the case thrown out. Now, some people will read they lost the first case. Some people will say it was thrown out on technicality, which is actually the truth. And yet the judge was considerate enough to say, hey, get your act together and come back. But that comeback took almost 2.5 years.
I can imagine it wasn't easy.
Well, 2.5 years later, in January of 1850 now, they came back to the courthouse. This time, a jury of 12 white men gave them their freedom by verdict because everything was in order, as I said. They had every reason to believe they would be free. And yet that freedom was not long-lived at all because Mrs. Emerson and her attorneys immediately filed an appeal.
What was the outcome of that appeal?
Well, essentially, it ended up in the Missouri Supreme Court. And when it went there, again, there was a good chance that they would win their freedom because once free, always free had been the law of the land. And they had ruled several times on those cases, giving individuals their freedom. However, on March 22nd of 1852, the three-man Supreme Court here in Missouri said that times were not as they once were when they used to judge on these things, and that they would not be giving them their freedom. They made several declarations that were pretty inflammatory, but the outcome was that Dred and Harriet had gone to the Missouri Supreme Court. It had been 6 years since 1856. It was now 1852, and they have lost yet again.
Oh, I'm so sad to hear that.
Yeah. So the next thing was, so what do? I mean, you've gone to, quote unquote, the highest court of your land, your state, and as enslaved people, I don't know, but there was providentially an attorney, a lawyer attorney that lived down the street from the Old Courthouse. His name was Roswell Field. And Roswell Field, as an attorney, was following the case. He had also looked into previous cases where slaves were trying to get their freedom and kind of understood how that worked. And he surely felt that this was a raw deal. Mr. Field came up with a wonderful, wonderful loophole. It's called the diversity clause, and the diversity clause was something he was able to use to help Dred and Harriet get their case back into the courts, but this time on a federal level.
So what was the diversity clause?
The diversity clause was a legal, in our case, loophole that said if you sue someone from another state, then you can take your case to the federal level. And the person he was going to be suing this time was not going to be Mrs. Emerson. A couple of years have passed, and now it's her brother, John V. Sanford, who has taken over the estate of Dr. Emerson. So the suit that they file will be Dred Scott v. John F. A. Sanford. And that's the case that is well known in history.
It sure is.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us more.
Okay, so John Sanford was a businessman, and he was his father's son. His father was very his father was very pro-slavery, and there was no way they were going to allow them to just get away. But they had won at the Missouri Supreme Court, and yet Dred Scott has brought his case yet again. And that takes some boldness, one might think. Okay, you've lost twice, and it took you 6 years, but now you're back. And so he comes back, and this time, his wife's name is not on the suit, but it is still her case. Their cases were combined because they were so similar. And then once they lost, they didn't have that dual track anymore.
Oh, boy.
But Dred pursued to sue again. And the long and short of it is that it went through the federal courts, and on March 6th of 1857, the infamous Dred Scott decision was rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court, where it had now been reviewed, and they made a decision based on very much a political bent, I would say. First of all, the new president coming in was going to be William Buchanan, and Buchanan had, in some ways, conspired a bit with some of the judges. In other words, he knew what the decision was going to be. And on his inaugural day, which was 2 days before the decision on March 4th, he said, well, we're going to have that Dred Scott decision come down any day now, and when we do, we will be happy to abide by whatever decision they come up with, knowing full well that they were going to side for slavery and against the Scots. Because whatever the Dred Scott decision was going to be would affect the nation.
You know, it took a lot for them to keep coming back and not giving up.
It did, and there are those years between 52 and 56 that we don't hear a whole lot about, but I've researched and found the documents I've been looking for many, many years, and I won't go into it today, but I have given programs on I call it the dogfight between Scott and Sanford that led up to the Supreme Court because they did not back down. And I think that that's an area of courage that we need to exalt, because had they not constantly and consistently gone back and forth, it may not have made it to the Supreme Court, but it did. And of course, we all know that the court sided against them, and they rendered several rulings. One was that African Americans would never be citizens because they had never been considered citizens. They said that was what the founding fathers believed, but that was not true of many founding fathers. In fact, it was not true, in fact, because there were free blacks, there were blacks who were citizens, there were blacks who owned businesses, and when this ruling came down, it was no longer based on once free, always free. It was based on whether or not blacks were citizens. And the court said they were not. And it said that they had no rights that whites were bound to respect. It said a lot of degrading things. It also decided that the Missouri Compromise, which had ruled that every other state that came into the nation would be free or slave alternately as it comes in, was unconstitutional. Congress had no right to do that, so they threw that out. That means that slavery could be in every state that was formed from now on, and all states passed. And the Northwest Ordinance, which was prohibiting slavery in the free territories, was also unconstitutional.
So, Mrs. Jackson, what was the overall outcome?
Once the Supreme Court made their ruling, there was no further appeal to be made. So it became the law of the land, and yet it was disrespected by the North and heralded by the South. And of course, all of us who know history about the Civil War, it was about the North versus the South. Dred Scott's case, his decision, was a major catalyst for that Civil War. It already had implications that were leading toward war, but this was just putting like a match to oil. And it didn't take much longer. However, another side point, which is interesting, is that because of the Dred Scott decision, Abraham Lincoln, who was considering getting out of politics, did a turnaround and said, oh, wow, this is really bad, and I think maybe I need to hang in here and deal with this. And ultimately became the President of the United States, who went through the war, and yet it's in part because of the Dred Scott decision. So we like to herald Dred and Harriet for the fact that they persevered to the very end. And through it all, it was 11 years and 5 court proceedings, but they lost the court cases, but they did get their freedom.
They did get their freedom. And how would you say they got it?
Well, the freedom was attained by the fact that Dred and Harriet had been, I would say, quote unquote, owned by Mrs. Emerson, even though her brother was being sued, and yet she married an abolitionist when he found out that she owned slaves, which he did not know. And I have the receipts now. We say I have the receipts to prove it. There are letters from the Library of Congress going back and forth about how can he help them get their freedom and get out of being a slave owner. Dr. Calvin Chaffee was no fan of slavery, and yet he found himself owning the most famous slaves in the country. And their case was very famous. It was in the national newspapers. And once the decision was rendered, it was every day in the news, every day in the news. And so because he was an abolitionist and because he would have no part of that, there was an understanding between him, Calvin Chafee, that's the owner of Mrs. Emerson's new husband, Roswell Field, the attorney, and then coming back to the Blow family, several of the children had helped him along the way, but Taylor Blow in particular agreed, and Dred Scott chose Taylor to be the person to do this, to purchase freedom bonds.
So, Mrs. Jackson, how exactly did they get their freedom?
Given the fact that Mrs. Emerson, as a widow, moved to Boston and married an abolitionist, conveniently did not tell him that she owned slaves. When he found out he owned the most famous slaves in the country, then he immediately set out on a plan to get them their freedom and get himself out of that business. It was very traumatizing for him, we know, and we do have the documents from the Library of Congress that shows the letters that went back and forth between Dr. Calvin Chafee, Attorney Roswell Field, Attorney Montgomery Blair, who actually pleaded the case at the Supreme Court, and Dred Scott, and then Taylor Blow. Taylor Blow was the 10th of the 11 children of the Blow family, and the plan was that Dr. Chafee and his wife would sell the family. Yes, sell the family to Taylor Blow for $1, $1 for Harriet, $1 for Dred, with the express purpose of freeing them. And Dred Scott said, if we're going to do this, then I want you to do this with Taylor Blow. He grew up in that household. He knew them. He was with them until he was at least 30. And there was just something there of that family. There were bonds there. And Taylor Blow was trustworthy to do that. And he immediately set forth to purchase freedom bonds in the courtrooms here at this old courthouse. And on May 26th of 1857, just 3 months shy of 3 months, they got their freedom at the old courthouse at the hands of one of the sons of their original owners.
Isn't that wonderful?
It's a good story because a lot of people say that all white people hate all black people. Doesn't be further from the truth. And we do study and share and talk about abolitionists. We don't call the Blow family abolitionists. They were just very, very decent people. And they had a Bible where their grandfather told them that in this life you will have slaves, but you will treat them with dignity and respect. You will treat them as people. And the family has done that. And I have to give a shout out to this current generation who I work with. The Blow family still lives on, and they are very much a part of my foundation. And I cannot tell you the wonderful relationship that we have.
So, what was the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision?
Well, aside from the fact that they got their freedom, as I said, it also was a major catalyst, which led to the Civil War, which led to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Oddly enough, sometimes they're called the Dred Scott Amendments, but they are also called the Reconstruction Amendments, and they are those amendments that help to solidify into our constitutional law those things that needed to be corrected. The 13th abolished slavery in the United States. The 14th gave citizenship to all people born in the United States, and that was primarily because of African Americans being told that they were not, nor would they ever be, nor would their descendants ever be citizens. Well, now the Constitution with the 14th Amendment is saying, yes, forevermore they shall. And the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. At the time, it was the black men, because women didn't get the right to vote until 1920, the 19th Amendment. But those three amendments corrected, rectified those things that slavery had taken from us.
Amazing. So, what happened to the family after this decision?
Well, again, they got their freedom on May 26, 1857. And even though it was a hard and long fought war, Dred Scott did die a free man. He just didn't get to be free very long. I'd like to make it very clear that he did not die a few months later, nor did he die 9 months later, but he died 17 months later on September 17th, 1858, That happens to be, ironically, Constitution Day. We just got through
Really?
talking about the amendments that were named for him and caused by him, his case. And so I always like to say God has a sense of humor. And he's done this on many occasions, but Dred Scott died on Constitution Day.
It was almost as if his life, he could pass the baton on and rest.
That's true. He did do his part. He did his work, and he was honored for it. And he's honored now, especially today. His wife, Harriet, however, she lived another 18 years. And Harriet, I like to say, is the first entrepreneur in the family. She had been a washerwoman, did laundry. I like the fact that she picked something that had to be done so she'd never be out of a job. And she taught her daughters to do the same as well. But Harriet lived to June 17th of 1876. She's buried in Greenwood Cemetery here in St. Louis, a very historic black cemetery with some very famous people in it as well. And Dred Scott is buried in Calvary Cemetery, which is a beautiful, very, very large Catholic cemetery. And how did he get there? He got there because the same Taylor Blow that paid for his freedom bonds, and really put his neck on the line doing that, by the way, he also saw to it that Dred was buried in Calvary when the original burial spot was going to be abandoned. And so 9 years after Dred Scott was buried the first time, he was reburied in this beautiful cemetery, which will never be abandoned. It has over 300,000 people, and it is virtually, he's like the number one person that is asked for. And we now have a beautiful, beautiful headstone for him. But I want to acknowledge the fact that originally he was in an unmarked grave for 99 years.
19 years?
99 years.
99 years, yes.
And in 1857, at the 100th anniversary of his decision, he was given a headstone at Calvary, and it was purchased by one of the granddaughters of the Blow family.
Oh,
all right, so it was very nice. It was small and modest, and yet the individuals who shared that this was his place where he was buried was a Jesuit priest, Father Dowling, and he said, hey, we found his grave site. The family already knew where he was, but for obvious reasons, it wasn't public knowledge. And yet by that time, they felt, okay, we can put a headstone here. And it's modest, he said, but if anyone ever wants to do more one day, they'll know where he lies. And that one day was September 30th, just 2 years ago, in 2023, and we put a beautiful new headstone, a 9-foot high headstone of black granite there for Dred Scott. And it tells his story now. So when those people come to see the most asked for grave at Calvary of one of the most famous slaves of our nation, they will go away knowing who he was, with a reverence, I believe, that will never leave.
So people can visit the memorial at Calvary Cemetery on West Florissant Avenue in St. Louis, Missouri.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So tell us about your foundation.
Well, the foundation was founded in 2006. It's not something I had planned to do. I had no idea it was coming. And yet, in providential ways, I was told to study Dred Scott, and at the same time, I felt, yeah, I should know more than the average person. So in 1995, with an unction from above, I did that. And yet, 2003, it became apparent that the 150th anniversary of the decision was soon upon us. And I felt that, well, the family should be able to do something rather than just watch this on the news. So I started a foundation. I'm making it sound real simple, but and it wasn't hard. It wasn't hard. But one of the things I knew I had to do was get other people excited about it. And so between 40 and 50 organizations in St. Louis came together under this umbrella of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation, and one of which was my law firm where I worked, Brian Cave, now Brian Cave Leighton Paisner. And they just said, hey, just let it go. And March of 2007, we were able to have an incredible year of commemoration for Dred Scott. And we were very careful not to say celebration because there was nothing to celebrate in the Dred Scott decision, but we certainly wanted to remember it. And the foundation is formed on three principles: commemoration, education, and reconciliation. I did not know what the third one was going to look like. The first two was a piece of cake. The third one was a mystery, but it turned out to be the most important of all. And we do have a group called Dred Scott Presents Sons and Daughters of Reconciliation, which I have encountered and worked with about 50 people who are descendants like myself of very famous historical characters whose cases mostly impact or indirectly affect or come in contact with the Dred Scott case. Next year, we hope to have another one of our conferences in St. Louis, but this time I hope to have as many of the 50 here as possible. And we would hope that in our 250th anniversary of the United States of America, that we will be able to come together with commemoration, education, and reconciliation through the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation.
Yes, we would like to see that happen as well. And we want to invite people to come here to the Old Courthouse in St. Louis to see the exhibition that the Parks Administration has helped create. And so we just want to say thank you once again to Mrs. Jackson for coming and being our guest and giving us this hidden gem of information and sharing these remarkable insights to help us uncover our history. I'm Gail Keys with 40 Music Production, and this has been a Hidden Gem History Talk. Until our next video, please like and share. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Jackson.
My pleasure. Thank you.